All right, everyone, it's me, but I am by myself. Today, I'm going to go through the Book of Ruth, chapter 3. I do not have the fellowship together due to unforeseen circumstances. We were not able to meet last week, and then I got sick this week with some type of a head cold thing, so I am going to... I feel like I'm running out of time, and I need to finish the Book of Ruth here before the new Torah cycle starts after the Feast of Sukkot. So I'm going to endeavor to do this by myself here, and hopefully it'll be a blessing to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a little prayer, and then we will tackle the Book of Ruth, chapter 3, together. How blessed are you, our Holy Father. You give us life and health. Everything that we have is from you, and you meet all of our needs. You are generous with your faithful servants. You challenge us and correct us to straighten our paths and test our faith and save our souls. You bless us with peace, even in the midst of difficulties. We are not even worthy of the kindness and the truth that you have shown to us. Praise be to your holy name. Hear, O Israel. Yeshua is our God. Yeshua is one. Blessed be his glorious name, whose kingdom is forever and ever. Glorious is our Messiah, Yeshua. He is our Master and our great salvation from God. We shall love you, of our God, with all of our hearts, with all of our souls, and with all of our resources. We shall love our neighbors as ourselves. These are our highest and greatest commandments. Father, teach us to speak truth, to be humble, control our physical appetites, and to provide faithful service to others with pure motives. Teach us to walk in your ways. We want to be pleasing to you above all else. Forgive our sins. We are crooked, and we need your help to fight the evil inclination and to stand firm in your truth. Guide us with a firm hand, but treat us with compassion. We are frail creatures, but if you will heal us, then we will be completely healed. If you will save us, then we will be truly saved. Please grant us a willing spirit to sustain us, that we might serve you more faithfully. We praise you, Holy Father, for you have shown great mercy to your faithful servants. You raise the dead, lift up the hurting, and give drink to those who thirst. We humbly ask you for healing and recovery, help and strength, courage and patience for the many that we know who are struggling and need your saving help, Father. Nevertheless, it is not our will that must be done, but yours. Teach us to believe in you and to place our complete trust in you. You are the God who supplies all of our needs, every day and forever. We know that all things work together for good for those who love you and are called according to your purpose, but our vision and our imagination is limited or corrupted, and we need you to open our eyes and our ears and give us hearts that are obedient and faithful. May your will be done in the heavens above and on the earth below, for you are the ruler of all heaven and earth, and we will praise you and thank you forever and ever. Amen. Now, excuse me, Ruth chapter 3, I want to, since it's been a little while since we have talked about Ruth, I wanted to kind of back up and give you just a little bit of a head start regarding land ownership in Israel and levirate marriage, because these things have become mixed up in our scriptures, and they kind of got mixed up in Hebrew tradition. So I think it's important to understand that biblically there really is no such thing as excuse me, land ownership in Israel. The Lord our God gave the Israelites this land. I mean, he promised it to Abraham and said, "It's to your descendants I will give this land." But you kind of have to remember that the land belongs to Yeshua, and that you don't really own it. You're what I suppose you would call a tenant in perpetuity. There's no definite term, that's saying that you get to keep this land for this period of time. It is you get to keep this land until such a time as I decide that you cannot keep this land. And that is delineated for us really clearly throughout the Torah, in especially at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where he talks about if you are faithful to his covenant, then he will be faithful to the covenant, and he will provide crops, good crop yield. He'll protect you from your enemies. You will be fruitful and multiply, both you and your children and your crops, and he'll bless everything that you put your hand to. So it almost makes one think that the only way that you could lose your land is by covenant unfaithfulness. And I know that gets into the situation that we've talked about on several occasions, where you think about bad things happening to good people, and that's always a challenge. And you can read the book of Job, some of the wisest people on the planet pontificating back and forth for 40-something chapters about why seemingly bad things happen to seemingly good people. So that's a debate that we can't answer, but what we do know is that these two things seem to be both true at the same time, which is that God will bless you and protect you, and things will go well for you if you abide by his covenant, and that they won't if you don't. But we also know that there is a wrench thrown into the works every once in a while, and that he is the author of it, or allows it to happen, for a good which we sometimes cannot see. Nevertheless, land ownership in Israel is very limited. That land belongs to God, and it seems that Elimelech, something went wrong, clearly, in the land of Israel, because there was a great famine, and he and his family were forced to leave, or perhaps chose to leave because there were greener pastures somewhere else. I heard a cute saying somewhere, I don't remember where it came from, but it was that, of course the grass is greener on the other side of the fence because someone is watering it. And that is so very true. If you, being a lazy farmer, are not watering your grass and you jump over the fence to the greener grass, well, it's going to die over there too because you're not watering it. And that applies to so many different things. It can apply to covenant unfaithfulness in regards to the land. It can correspond to a marriage, a relationship, a job. That the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence because someone has been taking care of that grass. They've been watering it and trimming it and pulling weeds out of it. And that's a really important principle, something to keep in mind. So how you can lose your land is through a financial catastrophe, and you would essentially sell the right to farm the land because you're not actually able to sell the land itself. You are really just selling the right to farm that land. And frankly, it really depends upon how the value of that land would depend upon how you, as a tenant of that land, had maintained it. It goes right back to the grass always greener. If you, being a diligent husbandman, had pulled the rocks out of the soil and put up fences and to keep wild animals out of your areas where you would be planting crops, and maybe pulling out making room for crops to be able to grow, then that land is more valuable than an untouched piece of land that has not been prepared to grow crops. So if you had a financial catastrophe or something, or maybe even an enemy came and took the land, it's certainly possible, you would lose it or have to sell it to someone who could use it. And obviously, land that is more valuable is land that has been prepared for cultivation. So it seems likely that Elimelech's property was at least fairly useful. We don't know from the story whether he sold it before he left, sold the rights to farm it before he left, or if Naomi is actually coming back to the land and is anticipating selling it now and is looking for a buyer, and the potential buyer might be Boaz, So it is potentially, either way, it doesn't matter, but to redeem that land, they're going to ask Boaz to redeem it, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But you lose your land, and the price of that land is based upon how many years of crops can reasonably be expected to be grown from that land. So if you have a nice piece of property that's ready to go for planting crops, you can sell it for a decent amount of money, sell the right to farm it for a decent amount of money. The crops that will be able to be yielded from the time that the purchase is made until the next Jubilee cycle, which you probably are aware happens every 50 years. So if I am in a position that I have to sell my property and the next Jubilee is starting in 10 years, that land is likely going to be less expensive because the person that I'm selling it to will only have 10 years worth of yield that they can take from it, because it has to revert back to me in 10 years in the Jubilee cycle. Now, if the Jubilee just came and went, and I've already experienced a catastrophe and I needed to sell it after only 5 years or something like that, then yeah, I got 45 years worth of crop yield that I can sell that land for. But no one, it seems unlikely that anyone would ever really want to sell their land, that's not what the desire was, at least to my understanding. So losing the land does seem to have some type of an indication of covenant violation. So losing the land in biblical Israel does have some negative stigma attached to it. You can lose it through a financial catastrophe or war, or your husband dies, all of which seem to come under the some type of an indication of God's favor is not upon you. And that's a challenging situation. Don't know exactly how to explain it, but there you go. So now you're selling the right to use the land, and the Goel, the kinsman redeemer, can redeem that land at any time before the Yovel, the Jubilee year, comes up again. And so this is what is taking place in our story in Ruth chapter 3. So I just wanted to review that with you briefly. Now remember that we talked briefly about levirate marriage before, and that was where in the Torah it talks about giving the wife of a deceased husband to the brother-in-law, but it does not extend in the way that you are seeing here in the Book of Ruth, where it's going to the nearest male relative. That is not what the Torah teaches. However, you can look at this as a tradition. The Hebrews, the Israelites, expanded this, as they are often wont to do. They will expand the commandments of God. And in this case, excuse me, in this case, I think that they have expanded this in a sense that it does seem to embrace the spirit of the law, and not just some type of an addition, willy-nilly, if you will. It seems to me that they have a situation where someone is in difficulties and they want to help, and they have sought for a way in which a kinsman redeemer can be sought from a more distant relative than just a brother. the dead husband's brother. So you can see in this story of Ruth that is extending to a near male relative, which is Boaz, but there's also a nearer kinsman, which we will discuss in just a couple of minutes. So, yeah, I want you to remember, though, that we talked about this briefly the last time we were together looking at Ruth chapter 2, where we saw that in all likelihood there's a good indication that this same type of extended kinsman-redeemer relationship was potentially practiced with Abraham and his brothers, where he had a brother who died, and it appears that both he and his remaining brother married the daughters of his dead brother, and then took Lot, his dead brother's son, under his wing to help him and guide him and become as a father to him. So this extended levirate marriage, if you want to call it that, does seem to be something that it appears that it does seem to be in the spirit of the law, and that this would be considered, in my opinion, a righteous expansion, and that this demonstrates a certain brotherly love that is extending even beyond what the Torah commands. And I don't see anything bad about that. Of course, to us in our modern world, it would seem very unusual indeed to marry your dead brother's wife. We would see that as just altogether wrong. But in the Torah, that is altogether right. And this story shows us even that happening to an extended family member. Now, that may have slightly less stigma to us, but nevertheless, there you go. So that's just a little bit of, getting a bit of a head start here as we go into these ideas of this person, Elimelech, having lost his land, and his near relative Boaz, and this other unnamed fellow being a kinsman redeemer, and how that whole thing is working. So let's now begin Ruth chapter 3. I will read it for you, and then we'll kind of walk through some of these things here. Now, Ruth chapter 3, verse 1 begins thus. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I should be seeking security for you, so that things will go well with you. Now there's Boaz, our relative. You are with his girls. He's going to be winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. So bathe, anoint yourself, put on your good clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But don't reveal your presence to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. Then, when he lies down, take note of where he's lying. Later, go in, uncover his feet, and lie down. He will tell you what to do." She responded, "I will do everything you tell me." She went down to the threshing floor and did everything as her mother-in-law had instructed her. After Boaz was through eating and drinking and was feeling good, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of grain. She stole in, crept in unnoticed, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, the man was startled and turned over, and there was a woman lying at his feet. He asked, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I'm your handmaid, Ruth. Spread your robe over your handmaid, because you are a redeeming kinsman." He said, "May Jehovah bless you, my daughter. Your latest kindness is even greater than your first, in that you didn't go after the young men, neither the rich ones nor the poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you everything you say, for all the city leaders among my people know that you are a woman of good character. Now, it is true that I am a redeeming kinsman, but there is a redeemer who is a closer relative than I am. Stay tonight. If in the morning he will redeem you, fine, let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, then, as Yeshua lives, I will redeem you. Now, lie down until morning. She lay at his feet until morning. Then, before it was light enough that people could recognize each other, she got up, because he said no one should know that the woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, "Bring the shawl you are wearing, and take hold of it." She held it while he put 6 measures of barley into it. Then he went into the city, and she told, she came to her, he went into the city, then, in verse 16, when she came to her mother-in-law, she asked, "Who are you, my daughter?" It's very strange. She told her everything the man had done for her. Then she added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, because he said to me, 'You shouldn't return to your mother-in-law with nothing.'" Naomi said, "My daughter, just stay where you are until you learn how the matter comes out, for the man won't rest until he resolves the matter today." Now that's a most interesting section, a fascinating section with lots of very strange things. So let's take a look at this for just a moment. Now, I want to back up just briefly and say that it likely some time has passed, because it was at the beginning of the story she is joining for the barley harvest, and it says also that she stayed and joined into the wheat harvest as well. It's likely that some time has passed and that we're talking about a different harvest here, because she has developed a reputation, according to what we saw in there, that Boaz said to her, "It is well known that you are a woman of good reputation." And you basically can't form a reputation in a community in just a short period of time like that. Well, unless you're a really dumb person or a bad person, you can form a bad reputation. And you might be able to fool people for just a little while into thinking you're good for a couple of weeks. But, to form a real reputation takes some time. And I would suggest at least a year, so, you get to know somebody. But it seems to me likely that Ruth has been around and been around in Bethlehem for at least a year, and that this is the next harvest that is taking place. Now, she has a reputation of strength, and which is very curious, because if you look in the text in the Hebrew, it actually says that she has a reputation of chayil. The Hebrew word is chayil, which is strength and valor, which is unusual for a woman. This is the type of word chayil which is used for a warrior, a strong warrior, a brave man who, in battle, generally is when this word is used. But it's used in regard to Ruth, which is pretty unusual. But it's likely because she is actually fulfilling the duties of a man, in a sense. She is the sole provider for both herself and her mother-in-law. She is a hard worker, and I definitely think that if you look at Proverbs 31, which I'm going to do, I'm going to read to you Proverbs 31. You've probably heard this before. I'm sure you have. The woman of valor, and this is interesting because this woman of valor in Proverbs 31, the word chayil is used both at the beginning in verse 10 and at the end in verse 29 of this proverb. So I want to take a look at Proverbs 31 with you for just a moment. I think you'll find this fascinating. Proverbs 31, and we'll start at verse 10. This says, who can find a wife of noble character? Now, noble character, wife, chayil, eshet, chayil, mi, yimsa. Who can find a virtuous wife? It's the same word. And this says, the heart of her husband has confidence in her, and he has no lack of gain. She brings him good and not evil all the days of her life. She obtains wool and flax, and she is pleased to work with her hands. She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. She also gets up while it is still night, and provides food for her household and a portion to her female servants. She considers a field and buys it. From her own income she plants a vineyard. She begins her work vigorously, and she strengthens her arms. She knows that her merchandise is good, and her lamp does not go out in the night. Her hands take hold of the distaff, and her hands grasp the spindle. She extends her hand to the poor and reaches out her hand to the needy. She is not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes for herself coverlets. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is well known in the city gate when he sits with the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies the merchants with sashes. She is clothed with strength and honor, and she can laugh at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and loving instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also praises her. Many daughters have done valiantly, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord will be praised. Give her credit for what she has accomplished, and let her works praise her in the city gates. I so think that Solomon, when he wrote that proverb, was probably thinking of his great-great-grandmother, Ruth. It just fits in that word. Chayil, being related to a woman, is just very uncommon. And so I would suggest that there's a definite connection there. So she has a reputation, she's going out to work again, and now we get to her going to out into the field. So Naomi is concerned for Ruth's welfare. You can see in Ruth chapter 1 verse 9 that she actually prays, may the Lord, may Jehovah grant that each of you find security in the home of a new husband. And so this has been the prayer of Ruth since the very beginning of this book, and it seems possible that she sees now an opportunity to meet with God, as it were, if I could put it that way, to say, I see an opportunity where God can do the thing that I have been requesting of him. I see an open opportunity. And she therefore says, this might work. Let's see if God's hand will bless it. And so she sends her on a mission to secure for her a good welfare, which is to be in the house of a loving husband. Because frankly, unfortunately, in those days, whether fortunately or not, it's actually questionable, that a woman can only really find security in the house of a husband. It would have been rather unusual for a woman to have been a single person and desiring to be single and not have children. That would have been quite unusual. But nevertheless, I digress. I apologize. So she tells her to bathe, anoint herself, and put on her best clothes. It seems like we could say Ruth's gone fishing for a husband. I know that's kind of funny, but what's interesting here is that she says that she is supposed to bathe, anoint herself, and put on her best clothing. Now, these aren't excuse me. these are not religious activities, as many traditional Christian scholars have suggested, because they see the connection between the Messiah and the kinsman redeemer. They tend to kind of infuse these, to make this a ritual bath, like a baptism, and an anointing of with some religious significance. And also, many commentators will suggest that she put on a wedding dress. I just don't think that the text really suggests that. That's a bit out there. That would have been very, very pretentious. But nonetheless, it seems likely that what is actually happening here is that Ruth is just making herself presentable. That she needs to bathe the dirt and the sweat and the stink off of her, and anoint herself with probably olive oil that is infused with a desert sage or some herb or something, as a cheap perfume, and that she puts on her clothes being cleaned. It's unlikely that these poor widows have a good set of clothes that they keep in the closet for special occasions. It just literally means clothes in the Hebrew. It doesn't say your best clothes. It probably is just an indication of clean yourself up, and let's go on a mission here to see if we can secure something for you. Now, what's interesting, and this is also rather curious, is that, Naomi says to her, bathe, anoint yourself, and put on some clothes, and then go down there. But in the text, it actually says that she went down there and then did as she said. It's almost like she has reversed it. Because Naomi says, bathe, anoint, put on clothes, and go down there. But the text says that Ruth went down there and did as her mother suggested. Now, the rabbis have suggested, and I think this is interesting, that she realized that if she gets dressed up and goes down to the threshing floor looking fancy and having put on her clean clothing and is looking nice and smelling nice, that she would have been likely perceived as a prostitute. And that would not have gone well at all. And that's also suggested as to why she snuck in there. It reminds me of the section of Genesis 37. Is it 37 or 38? I don't remember. I apologize. Where Tamar, goes to this area where Judah is going to be shearing his sheep, and she dresses up as a harlot, interestingly enough, in order to secure a child as a type of a kinsman redeemer from her dead husband's father, which is just, again, strikingly similar to this story of Ruth, which is interesting also because this is the first example of a levirate marriage type of thing that we see in Genesis 37 or 38. So it's just curious that she is told to go down here and do this, but it seems like Ruth maybe uses some wisdom or something, and she decides, you know what I'm going to do? This is what the rabbis say. I'm going to bathe and anoint myself and look normal, and then what I'll do is I'll carry my clean clothes in a bag, and when I get there, I'll put them on after it gets a little dark, and I'll put them on in secret so that people won't see me looking fresh and clean and smelling good and think that I'm a prostitute. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But nevertheless, to the best of our understanding, she is going out to try to get to attract this gentleman, Boaz. Now, what's interesting also is that when she says, and Naomi says to Ruth, go down there, and when you will see the place, and she actually says, I'm sorry, I'm digging through this this section here. And it says that you will go down to the threshing. I'm looking at Ruth 3, verse 3. Bathe yourself, rub on some perfumed oil, and get dressed up. It's from the Net Bible. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know that you're there until he finishes his meal. When he gets ready to go down to sleep, then take careful notice of the place. There's some repetition of words in verse 4, which is kind of interesting in the Hebrew. And the sages have suggested that it says that she is to seek out hamakom, which is in Hebrew, the place. But if you've been studying the Torah and the Torah cycle for any length of time, you might recognize that phrase, hamakom. That is the same phrase that is used in Genesis 20, maybe, where Jacob is fleeing from his brother Esau, and he's going to Mesopotamia to stay with Uncle Laban, and he sleeps overnight in the place and has this vision of God's, of this ladder going up to God, and angels going up and down on it. And he says this, this place, he keeps repeating that phrase, this place, and it is tradition. He says this is the house of God. It is tradition that place, Hamakom, is the place where the eventual temple to Yehovah would be built much later. Now, the rabbis point this out because I think they're trying to make a connection between the place where Boaz is threshing his wheat, or his barley, and the temple, which I think is interesting, just from the standpoint of what is happening here in this scene and who these people are and how they relate to the lineage of the Messiah Yeshua. I think injecting the idea of the place, the temple, to this is quite interesting. But I see a couple of problems with that potentially. Now, normally, when you're threshing wheat, and I you wouldn't know this unless you had lived back then or have done some research, because we don't really thresh wheat like this anymore. We have machines that separate the kernels of grain from the stuff left over. But in those days, they would just find usually a flat place where the earth is hard packed. And that certainly could be up in the threshing floor of Aruna, the Jebusite, where the temple of Jerusalem would originally be built. But remember that we're in Bethlehem, and I know that Bethlehem is not a good distance from that temple, but that is a bit of a hike, and it doesn't make a lot of sense that this man Boaz would bundle up all of his grain and carry it to Jerusalem. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that his land holdings where he went out to work was not a couple of miles away from the town of Bethlehem, and that it would have only been a couple of miles to Jerusalem. So it's an interesting idea. I just don't know if it makes best sense. It's more likely that they just carry the wheat, or the barley, I keep saying that, to an area of the field that has been hard packed for the purpose of using as a threshing floor. So what they will do is, this usually happens in late summer to early fall. It's actually right about the time we are at right now. Excuse me. And what'll happen is they will, in late summer like that, in the desert, we are from the desert here in Arizona. Many of you may not be. But you will know that these desert winds will kick up during the day, and it can become a little blustery out there. But in the evening, the wind calms down some, and it becomes a bit of a more gentle breeze, so that it's the perfect time for threshing your barley or wheat. In that, it is cooler. In those hour to 2 hours before the sun has gone down, and you can continue to work for just a little bit of time after the sun has gone down. But also that wind has died down a little bit, and if there's no wind, you're gonna use your forks or your sticks or whatever. You're gonna beat this grain on the ground to kind of separate the kernels from the chaff, and then you're going to use a fork or some sticks to throw this stuff up in the air so that the heavier grains will fall back down, and the wind or the breeze will blow the chaff off a distance so that they can be separated and collected on the hard-packed earth. But if that wind is too strong, it's just going to blow everything away, and that's not going to be good. And if there's no wind or not enough wind, then it's all going to come up and go back down. So that's likely what is happening in this situation, is that they have come to this place of threshing in the evening as the sun is going down. And after the sun has gone down and they can't work anymore, this is often a time of great celebration. There will be eating and drinking, and definitely this is talking about drinking some wine. It does say that, when his heart is merry, when his heart is happy, you should go and, sneak up on him. So that's likely what is happening here, and he's going to go lay down at the end of his barley stack in order to protect his investment. And she's now going to sneak up on him to do her business, whatever that is. So Rashi, excuse me, I've already covered that. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes. Now, yeah, sorry, I covered that already. Get ready and go down and get ready. We already discussed that. Now, uncovering his feet. This is most unusual. First of all, the word that is used here in the text is very strange. Margalot is the Hebrew word, where it says, uncover his feet. In most of the Bible, you will see feet is a different word. Is it like, oh gosh, I can't remember right now exactly what that word is, but it's a different word altogether. And this word, margalot, is used in the Bible only 4 times. When it says uncover his feet, margalot, feet, is used only 4 times. And it's used 3 times here in the Book of Ruth, and 1 time in the book of Daniel, which is unusual. And this is when he sees a vision of this angel that appears, and it's describing him as, hair, white, lightning, bronze, and then it talks about his feet. It's a very unusual word, and it most likely is referring to legs and not exactly feet. I can see in my Net translation Bible, it actually does say go and uncover his legs. So it just seems highly unlikely to me that Ruth is going to uncover the private parts of Boaz while he's sleeping, which has become a common interpretation for a lot of modern biblical scholars, these kind of literary criticism type people who are seeing something salacious in the text here, which I don't know is exactly there. Now, is there some type of sensuality? Is there some type of mysterious type of slight scandal in this section? Yeah, there does seem to be. But from what we know about these two characters, Ruth and Boaz, they both have been built up in our minds in this story so far to be, righteous individuals. And for her to go and sneak up on him in the night and uncover his private parts, it seems like a fairly whorish act that would not comport with her character. Remember, in the Torah, that it says that if a man and another man are fighting, and a woman is trying to rescue her husband from from this man that's fighting her husband, and she grabs his private parts, they're supposed to cut off her hand. That's hardcore. And thinking that this righteous individual, Ruth, would go and brazenly uncover the privacy of Boaz, and it doesn't comport with her known character. And so I can't tell you exactly what is happening here. Some have suggested that it's a simple thing where, she's uncovering his legs a little bit so that he'll wake up. Maybe sometime in the night he'll get cold, and it'll wake him up out of his sleep, and he'll notice her. And he'll wake up and see this woman down at his feet and say, who's this, and what are you doing here? And she'll say, oh, it's me, Ruth. And it does happen that it happens just like that, in a sense, where he says, well, who are you and what are you doing here? He says, wow, this kindness is even greater than the last. Which is interesting, because he seems to be saying, well, it's very interesting that he says, you've gone after me, which by all accounts he's an older man, a wealthy man, a prominent man in town, but he's an older man. He says, you didn't go after one of the young men, whether rich or poor, but you have actually come to me. And why would he be giving her accolades for that? I think that perhaps it's because he sees in her a willingness to follow the righteous custom of doing the right thing by seeking out a kinsman redeemer, rather than just going after a handsome younger man. And I don't even necessarily think he's talking about her going after a man who's her own age, because a man of that age would probably not be very well established and be able to take care of her very well. She certainly could have married a man who was older than her, but not nearly as old perhaps as Boaz was. So he seems to be commending her for being willing to follow their custom and seek the righteous path of finding the kinsman redeemer who will fulfill this traditional obligation of maintaining her family. And doing another kindness to her mother-in-law. She could have gone out and married any old Tom, Dick, or Harry in the community, but that would have left the seed of Elimelech's clan without an heir. That is the kindness that she is seeking to do to her mother-in-law. And that is what he is commending her for, is her unselfishness. She is willing to marry an old man. And in the chance, too, is interesting that he's apparently old enough to where even if he does marry her and give her a child, they won't be married very long. It's likely that he'll die way before she will. She might even love him, but her love and seeking out a loving relationship is not the top priority for her. She might come to love Boaz in every way, and yet the interesting thing is she's most interested in fulfilling her obligations to God by showing loving kindness to her family that she was grafted into. That is the clan of Elimelech. And she does this by seeking out the kinsman redeemer, even though he is an old man. Now, granted, he is a man of some means and a man of wealth. I wouldn't call her a gold digger necessarily. She's not Anna Nicole Smith. She is, I don't believe that. I believe that she is seeking to do what is right by her family. Now, so this whole thing about uncovering his feet is quite fascinating, but I don't care to speculate too much on that because, frankly, I'm not sure about it. Now, interesting to note also that it says that it came to pass at midnight, and that is a peculiar phrase, and I'm going to look at that as verse 8 in the Hebrew. It says, "Vahi bakatsi halayla," in the middle of the night. Now that same phrase occurs, I mean, where have you heard that before? In the middle of the night, at midnight. This is Passover language. This is the same phrase that is used when another redemption is taking place in the land of Egypt. This is it seems to be a reference to the events of the Passover. It is suggestive of a redemptive act. Some type of a redeeming is taking place. And I think that that's not for no reason that language was inserted here. That it says that at midnight he was startled. It almost says like terror overcame him, which is just so interesting because it's very, very similar to what we saw in the Passover narrative, where at midnight terror strikes the land of Egypt. Only in this case, we're seeing a different type of redemption. But you know what's interesting too is this whole thing is just filled with redemption language. You know, I mentioned a moment ago about her uncovering his feet, margalot. Margalot. Now, the Hebrew scholars have also looked at that word, margalot. It's only used 4 times, and it's kind of a mysterious word. You know, they have broken that word up into two different words to play with the language a little bit to try to gain some deeper meaning from it. And mar galot, you can probably already hear it if you have a little bit of a background in Hebrew. Mar is the word for bitter. Like, Naomi actually says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," which means I am bitter. Mar galot, if that same word can be pronounced galut, which is exile. So mar galot is bitter exile. See, that the sages have suggested that there's another bit of redemptive language here, is that the descendant of these two people, Ruth and Boaz, will redeem the bitter exiles. I think that's also fascinating language. And I believe that the eschatological prophetic utterances that we have heard from the Torah and the prophets suggests that indeed when the Messiah Yeshua returns, that he will give succor to the bitter exiles. All of us are in a certain amount of bitterness and are definitely in exile, living as we are, scattered among the nations. So that's a fascinating little bit of insight that the sages have discussed there. Now, interestingly, she says when he comes awake and he says, "Who are you?" She says, "I am your handmaid." Now, which is interesting because in the field, when he first met her, Ruth identified herself as a Nokri, which is a pagan foreigner. But here, she identifies herself as an Amma, which is a simple handmaid. And this shows her transition, as we've been discussing all along, that she went from being a pagan foreigner to a simple handmaid who is eligible for marriage. Amma, which is also a very interesting Hebrew word, it seems to have a word picture of the strength of the waters. Kind of like the idea of strong water is like glue that holds things together. It's just an interesting idea. So when she says, "I am your handmaid," she uses a very different word than she used the last time. She went from a Nokri to an Amma. Now, interesting to note that Boaz says there is another Redeemer who is closer than I am to the position of being able to redeem you. Now, we don't know who this person is. He's not given a name. We don't know anything about him other than and we'll deal with that when we get to chapter 4, when we have a little bit of interaction with this guy. But I just wanted to bring to your attention that there is another kinsman redeemer who is brought up. Now, why was he revealed? Why is there another kinsman redeemer that is introduced here, who is given an opportunity to redeem Ruth and Naomi, but declines to do so? There must be an allegory here. This is figurative of something. I just don't know what it is, and I have not, in my studies so far, come across the answer. But I hope to have something for you next time when we begin to look at Ruth chapter 4 that might have a little bit of insight into that, and perhaps I'll dig a little deeper and find something. But I just want you to keep in mind, and if you want to make a comment in the video or send a message or something, I'd love to hear what your ideas are regarding this other kinsman redeemer who is not willing to redeem this woman. He's capable, but he's not willing. But we'll deal with that the next time. Now, another thing that is curious about this section is that, first of all, Ruth is not recognized twice. Now, I can understand the first time when it's in the middle of the night and, Boaz wakes up and sees this form in the darkness underneath his, laying down at his feet and says, "Who are you?" But what's interesting is that the same thing happens when she returns home to her mother-in-law, and Naomi says, "Who are you, my daughter?" That's literally what it says in the Hebrew. "Who are you, my daughter?" Some translations have tried to change that around to suggest that what it meant was, "How did it go, my daughter?" I don't know that that's the truth. I think that this is repeated for a reason, and that this is being rather enigmatic. And there's a bit of a mystery here, is that Ruth is not recognized on both of these occasions. Now, excuse me, why is that? I'm not certain, and I'm not fully capable of giving you some fascinating answer. But again, one of those things to look at. But it occurs to me that perhaps Ruth, and this kind of goes back to Genesis 39 and 40, where we begin to see the interaction of Joseph and his brothers, not recognizing, excuse me, a family member who is a family member but is not recognizable because he appears to be a Gentile. This could perhaps be related to that, in the sense that Ruth is maybe a picture of the fullness of the Gentiles having come in and are not exactly recognized by the remainder of the family. So that's my idea, and I could be absolutely wrong about that, but I would suggest that we look into it just a little bit to see if that's possible. So next we have why is Ruth hiding? She's like skulking around and sneaking up on the dude when he's sleeping and stuff like that. Is it inappropriate to have women at the threshing floor? Is it because she's dressed up and people might think that she's a harlot? Is it because of simple impropriety? We discussed that briefly during the get ready and go down and go down and get ready. But I don't know why Boaz said, don't let anyone know that the woman was here. Another one of these mysterious things, and I hope you recognize in me in these last couple of points not being willing to just throw something out here and tell you this is what it means, because I don't know what it means. And it's okay. I have to be okay with that. Believe me, I'm not sometimes when I come across these mysterious things in the text, and I so want to have an answer for you. I want to be able to pull out something clever, but I don't want to just speculate wildly. I don't know exactly, but I think again it comes with the idea of this mystery of her relationship to the family and not being recognized as a family member just yet, or something like that. It appears to me to have something to do with this relationship with Joseph and his brothers, and the connection of the Gentiles and the Jews and being grafted in, which I think this whole story is so clearly about, that's all tied together in some way. Nevertheless, I digress. Things for you to think about, things for you to kick around. Quite fascinating stuff. But now, it says that he gives her 6 bushels of something. What's fascinating is that Rashi suggests that we look at Isaiah 11 in regards to what these 6 bushels that he gave her represent, which I think is quite fascinating to discuss, because of the lineage of the child that she will eventually give birth to. If you take a look at what happens, is he again gifts her a whole bunch of food. He tells her to hold out her outer garment. This is probably really similar to, not a shawl necessarily, but an outer garment that is like when Yeshua was crucified, that the soldiers cast lots for his clothing, but that tunic, it says, they did not, it says that they divided his clothing, but the tunic they cast lots for, because they didn't want to tear it because it was a single piece. That is an outer garment, which is wrapped around the body and can be slept in kind of like a blanket, and is used as a blanket. It's likely that is what is being talked about here, and she is given 6 some measures of barley. And Rashi suggests that we look at Isaiah 11, verse 2, to suggest what these 6 bushels of barley represent. And Isaiah 11:2 says, well, I'll start at 1. It says, a shoot will grow out of Jesse's root stock. A bud will sprout from his roots. The Lord's Spirit will rest on him, a spirit that gives extraordinary wisdom, a spirit that provides the ability to execute plans, a spirit that produces absolute loyalty to the Lord. He will take delight in obeying the Lord. He will not judge by mere appearances or make decisions on the basis of hearsay. He will treat the poor fairly and make right decisions for the downtrodden of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and order the wicked to be executed. Now, this is to us who are of a Messianic persuasion, see the Messiah Yeshua very clearly in Isaiah 11. And it's interesting that Rashi says that these 6 bushels of barley represent what you see in verse 2, which I'm sure that you've probably heard, if you haven't, you should. Hollissa Alewine, in her Creation Gospel series, speak about the spirit of the Messiah, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might and knowledge and the fear of Yehovah. Interesting to note that Rashi actually connects those things. These 6 bushels of barley to represent the spirit that will be upon the child. I think that it's the spirit who will be upon a descendant of the child and not necessarily the child itself, Obed. But we'll talk about that again later. Just a fascinating insight. Now, one final thing as we're wrapping up here. Naomi says to Ruth, just kind of hang back here because the man will not rest until he's completed the matter. Now, I think that this is highly instructive for us. It certainly should be. You know, it has been suggested that Boaz's name means alacrity. And they suggest that his name means alacrity because of this characterization of him, as he will not rest until he has completed the matter. This apparently is a guy who wants to get things done and do them now rather than later, and that is a man of action. Now, to me, when I look at this, it instructs me regarding a defect of character that plagues so many of us. And it really has to do with being procrastinators. And that should really not characterize followers of God, that we should act with alacrity. And when someone says they would like help, or when we say that we're going to do something, we should do it sooner rather than later. We often put off things that should be done right away and do things that we want to do rather quickly. I know that I get, terribly irritated when someone says, I'm going to do something, and then they don't. Or they say they're going to do something, and then they do, but it takes them a long time to do what they said they were going to do. And generally after much prodding, where you have to remind them, send them an email, say, hey, what's up? You said this, and you were going to help out with that, or that's a bad characteristic. And I think that we really ought to try to emulate Boaz when it comes to being people of alacrity. When you say you're going to do something, you should always do it. But I think it behooves us to take it even one step further and do it now. Do it right away. The person who you have said that you will get them something, or you'll do this part of your work, or if your boss says, hey, I need that report by Friday, or you're your refrigerator has broken, which mine has, but it has been replaced. Thank you, Lord. What if your refrigerator company that's going to replace your broken refrigerator says, man, we can't get you a new refrigerator until 4 days from now. You're going to have to live out of ice chests for the next 4 days. But we'll get it to you 4 days. We promise. That's the best we can do. Well, you put up with it and you say, okay, it's better than the other place who said it's going to be 2 weeks. Well, what if that company called you and said, after only 2 days had passed, and said, hey, we've got your refrigerator. Is there any chance we can come early? Well, of course there is. I would be absolutely delighted. You imagine how delighted you are or your boss is when he says the report's due Friday and you email it to him on Wednesday. He's going to feel the same way you are when your refrigerator shows up after 2 days instead of 4. This is just loving kindness, I think, to under-promise and over-deliver. And I'm not saying that you should seriously under-promise, because I don't think that's right either. But too many of us, I think, are either A, not people of our word, and when we say we're going to do something, we don't actually do it. Or B, it takes some cajoling and some prodding before we actually get around to it. This should definitely not characterize us as people of God. It's a bad characteristic, and I strongly want to encourage you all to begin to look at areas of your life where you have obligations, or where you obligate yourself, where you're not even asked to obligate yourself, but you do. Always be a person of your word. When you say something, it is gospel truth. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. If someone, and this has to do with being assertive, and I'm talking about a little bit of pop psychology here, and I don't mean to, I apologize. However, I will. Be a person whose yes is yes and no is no. Don't say maybe. If you know that you really are not going to do it, then don't say yes. Don't say maybe. Don't leave them hanging. If somebody says, can you help? Can you do this? Will you do this? Don't always answer right away. If you need time to think about it, run it by your husband, run it by your wife, talk with somebody about it. There's wisdom in good counsel. If somebody asks you to do something, you're thinking about making an obligation, think about it for a little bit. Don't answer right away. Say, let me reflect on that and get right back to you. And think about it, pray about it. If it's something that you can do, then you should, and you should, then you should, then do it. But if you say you're going to do it, absolutely do it. We need to be people of our word, because that is so rare these days, unfortunately, is people who are really people of their word. When you say you're going to do something, do it 100% of the time. And in fact, not only am I going to do it, I'm going to do it a little bit quicker than you were expecting it, perhaps. Or maybe I'm going to go just a little bit beyond what you were even expecting. With this type of a demonstration of love for your fellow man, your fellow believer, or an unbelieving person, you give a tremendous testimony to the God who says what he's going to do, and he does it. Now, it oftentimes isn't very terribly quick, not from our perspective, but remember, 1,000 days in a year, 1,000 days is like a day, and a day is 1,000 years. You know what I'm saying. Nevertheless, I hope that has helped you. I hope that this little study of Ruth chapter 3 has been okay. I'm sorry that we weren't able to do it all together as a group, but if you have comments or questions or concerns, I highly encourage you to send me an email, put a message on YouTube or on the website or something like that, and we'll see if we can address them. But I'd love to have your feedback, and we will be getting together at some point in the near future to finish the Book of Ruth, and then we will begin the Torah portion cycle for the for the new year coming up. So I think that'll be very exciting. Here at Yeshua Kingdom, we have not ever done the Torah cycle together, and it's a fascinating and awesome study, and I think you'll really enjoy it. So thank you so much for joining me, and I pray that you'll be blessed and have a great week. May the Lord heal you and protect you and guide you and strengthen you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.